Welcome back to the Blurred Lines finishing series. In this installment, in the second video, I'm going to show you how to set a drop shoulder sleeve into the side of the work here for the sweater. Okay, so I've got my shoulders already seamed. Beautiful. I left all my tails. I'll deal with those at the end. And I'm going to lay my sweater flat where my seam is right here in the middle. If you are somebody who sews with fabric and makes garments, this will seem a little strange to you. It'll be different from the usual, but that's kind of fun, isn't it? So just follow along. You'll see how I seam together the sleeves. Oftentimes your pattern will tell you to mark off a certain measurement. Maybe you put it in as you were knitting to fit the sleeve into the side of the sweater. In this pattern, I do tell you mark down from the shoulder seam a certain number of inches. You can do that. Here I'm just going to measure the top of my sleeve. I see that it's about 16 inches. So I'm going to place my tape measure at the 8-inch point at the seam, and I'm going to mark off on the sweater where that 8 inches is. And you would do the same on the other end as well to mark off the space in which your sleeve needs to be set in. However, in this case, I have a repeating pattern on both sides of the sweater. So my marker is on this section where I have 3 stripes right in the middle, right? It's on that center stripe. So I'm going to just go to the center stripe over here and mark that off. And I'm going to do the same on the other side of the sweater. So I'm using my stripes as a guide to help me figure out exactly where my sleeves should end in the sweater. And that will be the most visually appealing as well once I've completed the sweater. There's nothing worse, of course, than getting a striped sweater done and realizing when you sewed the buttons on, the stripes are, mismatched. And same goes for seaming. You want to make sure that the visual of where the sleeve lands, if you have some sort of repeated pattern, is the same. So I'm going to, when I seam the other side, I'm going to trace across this line and place those armhole markers right here and there to match the other side. So that's the first step, is figuring out the space that you need your sleeve to be set into. The second step is getting your yarn. Right? So here I'm actually going to take a generous 3 times the total length from bottom over there to top over there of the sweater, plus a bit. So it's a huge amount of yarn. And you might be thinking, that is a lot, Shaina, for that one seam. It is. You're right. But it's not just for that one seam. This piece of yarn is going to be for the armhole and for the side and sleeve seams. So certainly it doesn't need to be this long. If you would rather just attach yarn as you go, that's fine. I like to have fewer tails when I seam, so this will leave me with just 2 ends, one for the sleeve and one for the body, and that brings me much joy. All right, so I've got my yarn. It's on my tapestry needle. The next step is to find the center of the sleeve. So to do that, I'm going to fold it in half. And boom, I found my center stitch. If you prefer, if you're very precise, or if you have a ribbing perhaps vertically that you can trace up and find your middle, you can do it that way too. But here I'm just going to grab the A that's right in the center of the sleeve. And that's similar to what we did on the shoulder seam, right? We've got stitches here, so we're grabbing A's and V's. But here we actually have rows. It's a little different. Our stitches are sitting on their side. So let's just start by grabbing that center A, and I'm going to pull my yarn through until half of it remains on the other side. So I'm going to just eyeball it. And I've left half of my yarn out here, and I have the other half here. So I'm going to be seaming 1/2 of the sleeve, turning the work around, seaming the other half of the sleeve with this piece of yarn. That is how I set in my sleeves, which is what might shock you if you've done sewing before or tried seaming sweaters with knitting before, and that might be different from what you've done. All right, so we've got our center here. The next thing we have to think about is the fact that rows and stitches are not the same size. So here we have an 8-inch space and an 8-inch space, and I don't know, I'm going to take a wild guess. There are maybe 35, 37 stitches here, and there might be 50 rows here. So again, these measure the same amount, but there are more rows than there are stitches. So as you are connecting any piece in knitting that has stitches to rows, you can't just seam at a 1-to-1 ratio because there are not one row for every one stitch. There are 1.2 or 5, or there's a certain, it varies depending on your gauge, but there are more rows than stitches in every inch of knitting, depending again on your gauge. So I'll show you my trick for that to figure out how to set a different number of stitches into a different number of rows. So we've grabbed our center stitch here. Now we need to find our first row on this side. But before we do that, I'm going to just go into the middle of the fabric here to show you what a row looks like. A row looks like this. It's a little bar, or in this case where I have a purl stitch, a little bump, or in this case here, a bar and a bump. So it's the belly button, if you will, of the stitch. The center of a V is the row. Okay, so we're going to uncurl the edge of the work, and again, stockinette curls, that's normal. As you are seaming, just uncurl. What we're going to work in is the very first column that is clean looking. So I'm not going on this edge here. That is too messy because that's where we turn our work when we're knitting rows, and so the stitches are uneven on the side. We're going to start in the very first clean looking stitch, which means we technically have a full stitch selvage here. If that didn't make sense to you, don't worry, just go for it and do. So I'm going to come up to the seam right here, and I'm going to dive in and scoop up rows. A row anyway. So I dove in from the right side and I came back up on the right side. And then here I'm taking a full stitch. Here I'm diving in, same hole that the yarn's coming out of. I'm uncurling the edge with my fingers, so you'll see my left hand is holding those stitches flat. And then I dive into the same stitch the yarn is coming out of, and I scoop up one stitch, or one row, excuse me. So far I've taken a 1-to-1 ratio here, stitches to rows. So we do need to work on that. And the way that I'm going to speed up the number of rows that are taken in relation to stitches is that every so often I'm going to dive in and pick up 2. So generally speaking, I pick up at a 3-to-4 ratio, that for every 3 stitches, every 3 V's or A's, I pick up 4 rows. So here's 1-to-1, 2, and here's the second bar. And then here's the third stitch, and here's 3 and 4 in terms of rows. So I pick up always a stitch on this side, and then on this side I pick up 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2. And so as I'm seaming, I just kind of keep that chant going in my brain. 1 stitch, 1 to a stitch, and 2, 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, always to a stitch. And just keep going, letting your left hand uncurl or open up the fabric a little bit so that your right hand can just get in there nice and smooth. And then you want to make sure as you're doing these rows, the tricky part can also be staying in the same column or the same railroad track. So you want to make sure that all of your rows are coming off of the same stitch here. so that you keep one stitch nice and clear on the edge. So the place where this gets tricky is once you've pulled, it can be a little hard to find that column again. Make sure you loosen up. And there's the stitch. That will help you stay in the correct column. So again, we're taking an A on this side, so full stitch on the bound off edge, and the stitch has to point towards the seam. Right now the seam is up here, so A points up towards the seam. And then a 1-1-2 ratio, or a 1-1-2 pattern on the top in terms of the bars. Once I've gone about halfway, I usually reassess. So I'm about a third of the way at this point, 2/5. And it seems like I have extra rows still. Like it seems like the row section's a little wider. So I'm going to switch for a moment to a 1-2-1-2 patterning. So I just got a 2. I'm going to get a 1. And then a 2. So you can change that ratio. So now I'm picking up 2 stitches for every 3 rows here. So a single stitch to a row, and then a single stitch to 2 rows. Just for a bit until I feel like everything's evened out again, and then I'll reassess. So that's why we're calling this setting in, because we're setting it into the placement of our markers. We're pushing the sleeve into the hole or into the space that we wanted it to be. And you'll notice I did not sew up my sides and sleeve seams, leaving a gap and then trying to put this in as a circle. I think it's much easier to seam flat. So that's what I've done here. So the 1-2-1-2 ratio seems to be working out okay. I'm going to keep that up. And then I'm going to remember that that's how I did this sleeve, or this half of the sleeve, when I go to do the other sleeves. I'm going to keep that ratio in mind, that I started off with a 1-1-2 pattern and that I finished the sleeve with a 1-2-1-2 pattern. So the first sleeve really sets the tone for the others, which is nice, because then you can kind of do the other portions of the sleeves much more quickly. And even here, let's see, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 rows, 7 stitches, and 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 rows. So I'm going to finish off this part of the sleeve with a 2. Just taking 2 rows to 2 rows, or I'm sorry, 2 rows to a stitch consistently. And then even if I wanted to, maybe for other sleeves, I would start that 2-1-2-1 patterning more quickly or sooner than I had started it here. All right, so there we go. I got to the end. I should have pulled these tighter sooner, but I just get on a roll and I keep going. As a beginner finisher, you should definitely pull this yarn every inch or so just to make sure that you have not created any knots in the yarn by going backwards a stitch or accidentally snagging the yarn. But that's the first half of my sleeve cap, or my drop shoulder fitting into the side of the sweater. Next thing I do is turn the work 180 degrees. That way I'll be working from right to left again. I grab the yarn that was waiting right here for me, put it on the tapestry needle, and then begin my seam. But before I do, I've realized I have a lot of yarn here, and I didn't have as much yarn in the underarm for the other side, so I'm going to pull the underarm yarn, or the yarn that's sitting at the end of what I just seamed. That way I've shortened this piece and lengthened the other. So a good mattress stitch seam, you should be able to pull this finishing yarn straight through if you wanted to, so be careful. So here, I'm going to start again. I've got my first stitch taken from the sleeve. So I'm going to start here at the body, and just by the nature of the join here, the stitches are off by a half when you seam together the shoulders. So I'm going to go in a bit at an angle to get into my correct placement where I want to be. So my bars are coming from down here. I uncurl the edge, open up the stitches, and seam. And again, on this side, I think I'm going to do the 1 2 1 2 more frequently rather than the 1 1 2 1 1 2. Since I had to kind of play catch up at the end of the other sleeve. So I'm staying in the same railroad track. I'm opening up my stitches, grabbing them, coming through. And every inch or two, you're going to pull tight. When I say tight, I just mean close up the seam. We don't want it to be so tight that it puckers. We just want it to be closed. And then loosen up the last stitch and carry on. The nice thing about knitting is that it is stretchy and bouncy, so you can take your hands and really open up the fabric if you need to. I could go like this if I wanted to and stretch it out to find the holes that I'm going into, and then it does bounce back into shape. Within reason, of course. Different fibers behave differently, but don't be afraid to pull this yarn, and don't be afraid to open up the fabric to see what you're looking at and what we're dealing with here. It's one of the benefits of a knit fabric. Flexible and soft. If you ever have a little tug, if you're not sure if it's a knot, first try to wiggle that tail up and then pull tight. Sometimes what we think is a knot is really just a little bit of like a snag from the pulling. So first try that just to unhook the snag. And if that doesn't work, if you're convinced that it's definitely a knot, then you'll have to just undo your seam until you get to that point. But occasionally you don't have to undo, so troubleshoot first. Rip second. Here we go. I'm getting close to the end, and it feels like I have my ratio worked out pretty well with the single stitch to 1 row and then a single stitch to 2 rows. In fact, right here, let's see, maybe now, let's give a count now that we're close to the end. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stitches. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 rows. Aha, so now I'm going to change to a 1-to-1 ratio. If that really pesters you, working all single rows to single stitches, and you'd rather, work that throughout, you could rip back to here and then fit in those extra rows or fewer rows as you go along. For me, this doesn't bother me. I'm okay with going about it this way. Another beautiful thing about knitting is that we can each let our own personality shine through. For me, I'm just happy to get it seamed. Occasionally I will rip out a piece and work it in a different way, but this amount of just single bars is not a big deal to me. All right, and again, as usual, I went a little far without pulling. Usually if that happens, here I just hit a snag, so I'm going to loosen that up. And then it goes nice and smooth. So here's our sleeve seam. Shoulder, the sleeve seam, and now I'm going to take the marker and trace across this line here to the exact spot on the other side. Place my markers on that side of the sweater and then set in my other sleeve. I'll see you for the third video, which is going to be the side and sleeve seams when you're finished with that step. Happy seaming!